If there was a playbook for how to do this, it would just be called the way. The truth is like all of the biggest outcomes are extreme outliers, and there is no path. I don't believe. Maybe this is a little different than a lot of folks in venture, but I don't believe in pattern matching.
Hey folks, today I chat with Nick Washburn, Senior Managing Director of Intel Capital. This conversation is a masterclass for any investor, where we cover good ground from the intricacies of reserve strategies to the common pitfalls VCs often encounter. And for context here, Intel Capital, the venture capital arm of Intel Corp, has long been regarded as a role model in the venture world, backing companies like Red Hat to VMware to DocuSign. They've had north of 250 IPOs in the past 3 decades, another 500 exits, and since 2018, had something like 12 billion of market cap companies hit the public markets. Trust me, this insider look of chasing the puck in venture with Nick Washburn is not to be missed. I hear that you're quite the ice hockey fan. Can you tell me a little bit about, the lessons in ice hockey that I guess you bring to your investments and also to life?
Yeah, I love ice hockey. I still play. I actually played an ice hockey tournament this weekend with a bunch of friends. My father, who's in his early 70s, still plays a couple times a week too. There's a famous ice hockey player, Wayne Gretzky's, the great one, the best hockey player of all time. And famously, he always said, the reason why he was very good is because he would go to where the puck was going, not to where it was. And I think that's venture. That is it. It's just thinking about the future, where markets are going, where consumer sentiment is going, what's next, and be able to think ahead. I can honestly say I enjoy the practice more than the games, if that makes sense. And why I like venture is I just like the process of learning and diving into things much more than the outcome necessarily. And so I think that does enable me to take on more risk when I'm looking at opportunities and thinking about things, because I'm not necessarily worried about, I'm not fearful of failing. I'm just much more enjoying the process of it.
Fascinating. I love the systems and processes, inputs versus output. But of course, that isn't necessarily the way that a venture investor looks at his or her investments, right? I mean, these days, the question on liquidity, the question on exits is top of mind. What are your thoughts there in terms of shaping your founders in a certain direction to be less output focused, but still demanding a certain kind of output?
I think it takes aligning of the stars and many things to go the right way over a long period of time to have huge outcomes, particularly in venture, given it's so power lawed. And there's only so much, founders control. There's only so much investors control. And so I think it's really kind of, once again, I try to focus on the practice in the day-to-day. And so when I work with founders, it's very similar. Certainly, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. There's macroeconomic stuff. That's very much outside of the control. How you ship your next feature, who are the next 3 people you hire, how you think about really at the atomic level, solving a pain point for an individual buyer that's 20 times more important than the next best thing that they have to focus on. That's really what's inside your control. And so a lot of it is I don't really coach our founders on planning through or thinking through the exit. It's really focusing on what's that next incremental thing you're shipping. I think when teams do that and they do it successfully, the path kind of creates itself a little bit. If there was a playbook for how to do this, it would just be called the way. The truth is all of the biggest outcomes are extreme outliers, and there is no path. I don't believe. Maybe this is a little different than a lot of folks in venture, but I don't believe in pattern matching.
Ooh, I love that. And in fact, pattern matching comes up a lot in my conversations, right? Because part of why the gender venture funding gap exists is because we're pattern matching to past patterns that did not necessarily include women and people of color. And of course, VCs are supposed to be, I guess, contrarians in some way. Why is pattern matching still, for many, unlike you, so you're the contrarian in this way, still the standard in some way?
Judge me in 15 to 20 years if my approach is right. School is out. I think it's because it's easy, Sarah. It's easy to say this team went to MIT and Harvard and they're building something where this market has done before. And so it's just the path of least resistance. I think the truth is it's like there's a bunch of different gates to decide how. At the end of the day, you have 24 hours in the day, just like I do. And you have to decide where you want to spend time. And, a lot of that comes down to the people you want to spend time with and how. When I work with founders, I focus a lot on folks that I think have a learning mindset in the sense of like have very strong beliefs about what they know very, very well. And then everything else they lean in towards learning and they lean in towards finding expertise around the table. Like I don't have expertise in quite a lot. And so I focus on a network of people to kind of help me out. And I think really successful founders do the same. And over time, I think that just indexes me a little bit towards highly technical, humble, work really hard. And I've had the privilege of working with great diverse teams. I'm on the board right now of several companies that have incredibly strong female co-founders, CTOs that like run. Olga at Modern, she's in charge of all the product strategy. Effectively, the entire company reports up to her. She's one of the best product thinkers I've worked with. Or Dana at AutoTune, she had a PhD research in tuning databases and is a really, really strong founder. And so I think you just need to index towards the kinds of individuals you want to work with because it's not hard. To be honest, it's very, very hard to build, legendary companies, and it takes a village to do so. And I just try to not focus necessarily on the background of folks, but more of their understanding the problem statement and why they feel best positioned to solve it.
What have you seen in the years of investing that you've had now under your belt? You're on the board of Altera, Fly.io, FreshPaint, Modern, so many others. What do you see as outlier qualities that makes a really good founder to stick it through?
All these things are really hard to judge. It's like 20/20 hindsight, as they say. You kind of always, it's until you see someone and you work with them through that process, it's really hard to ultimately know. I think I try to bring an approach of, here at Intel Capital, and myself in particular, I guess I'd say, like, trying to be really thematically focused. And so I focus on like a pretty narrow area. I mean, it's kind of like embarrassing to share, I suppose. Like, I'm not spending really any time on AI right now. Even we're infrastructure software investors, we're prolifically investors in AI and have been for decades, just because, one, we have enough people looking at it. Two, I think it's where kind of everyone's going focusing. So I want to kind of go look elsewhere where I think there's other opportunities. And three, I just think like when I talk to folks who are working on more core problem statements that are not the latest shiny object, it's because they have deep passion for those problem statements. It's usually born out of something like it's a problem they almost feel like maniacally compelled to solve because it's mind-blowing to them it isn't solved. I'll spend a lot of time before I talk to founders just trying to like really, it's back to like the process of learning. Like I feel like I get paid to learn. It's awesome. And so I'll just spend a lot of time researching an area, talking to like hypothetical end customers, really trying to understand, okay, this thing seems very small right now, but like over time, it's a very big problem for you. But over time, like there would be a lot of value capture. Now I'm wrong all the time, but it's like, that's the approach I try to start out with. Once I start to think about a problem statement, then I go try to find the best teams working on it. That's another example. I get inbound deal flow, but like most of the deals that you mentioned, the investments, like Altera, I had already spent a lot of time around intent-based networking and like what I thought was a new way to handle the growing complexity of networks. We reached out to Rahul. Modern, I reached out to Jonathan and Olga, like as part of mutual connection, but thinking through the problems of like aging code frameworks. And so I tend to do a lot of outbound and just reach out to smart builders in a space where like I think that there's underpinnings of probably like a big category that could get created over time, but rooted in like a problem statement that's pretty urgent to a very particular persona, like here and now. And the question is, over time, how does this grow? I mean, we have pretty interesting debates like internally. I think about this all the time. You hear about TAM, like you need to have really big TAMs in venture markets. I don't focus on them at a really early stage because the truth is, I think there's two kinds of sins in venture, sins of omission and commission. Now, commission, like making a choice, like I think if I over-focus on a TAM really early, I'm probably going to make the wrong choice of convincing myself of something that's going to have a big TAM when it doesn't. Or the sin of omissions, the bigger one, you'll pass on something because you don't think has a big enough market. But in truth, if you look at all the biggest outcomes in venture, they look like super niche categories to start. There's like a famous saying, it's not the TAM you start with, it's the TAM you end with. And so it's back to like this pattern matching thing. I'm not wired that way, so to speak.
I love that we are almost excluding AI from this conversation because you're saying you're not spending much time on it, which is almost a sin in 2024. But of course, yeah, this is the contrarian on the show, right? But how are you thinking about where the puck is moving? I mean, in terms of cloud infrastructure, what gets you excited? Where do you think we should be spending our money on instead of, I guess, the overblown valuations that anything AI has these days?
I admittedly invest a lot in like the picks and shovels. So tooling and like lower level infrastructure of like underlying application software. I won't speak to existing investments, actually. I'll speak to like just new areas I'm looking at where we have not made an investment, but I'm intrigued by. And it's always like starts out with like application patterns. And so, in like how you build it. When I look at like the existing software development workforce, like devs live everywhere. People are in different time zones. There's a lot of async work. And there's been this problem statement around software development that existed as long as software development has existed, which is this works on a machine, not in production. I work on my local laptop. It's the best experience for writing software. I download all of the libraries and packages and dependencies and stuff I need to build this application. I'll write a bunch of code. I'll merge it into like our source code management tooling system. And then when it goes through testing and production, it doesn't work. There's always this like, well, it worked here, but why does it work here? This is a huge problem statement. Like every company on the planet has it. And I think there's a lot of different ways you could tackle that problem statement. So there's cloud developer environments. If you think about how software is created, everyone builds for the cloud, but developers don't really use the cloud themselves. They work on their local MacBook because it's very, very fast and there's not internet. So how do you bring it up? Or how do we handle like build tooling and package management? Like a very, very big problem too. So there's a lot of like nascent stuff there. We'll talk about Figma a little bit. It's like people love that product. Why do they love that product? It runs in the browser and it's like instantaneous. It's like such a magical experience using something where you and I can collaborate. Or think about like Google Docs, where it's like collaborating in real time. On some time basis, 15, 20 years, I think that's how all applications are going to be built. Because we as consumers expect it. I think it's going to need to work both offline and online. It's going to need to run in the browser and it's going to be extremely fast. Doing that is very, very hard, like underneath the hood. And there are lots of ways that you need to kind of handle this, from the database layer to how you do state reconciliation between what's running on a client versus server, to just the building blocks for building applications that way, because most companies don't need to build it themselves. They should use abstractions. And so there's a big movement around local first software. I don't necessarily like that term because it's too broad of an umbrella, but once again, pushing much more data and computation like into the client itself, like into the web browser, into the mobile phone. There's new lower level primitives like WebAssembly that are kind of interesting for how you could write applications in any language and run them anywhere, regardless of the operating system. It's very early, but I think that's interesting. We can talk about all the AI things, but in truth, it's like the largest enterprises on the planet still run workloads at mainframes. just so much embedded sunk costs and organizational design into heavy monolithic old software that needs to be refactored and make it into something that's more modernized and usable. Not just because they want to be doing the latest and greatest, but it's all built on old aging frameworks that aren't even supported anymore. So it causes a huge security risk to those companies as well. So it's stuff like that I'm interested in these days.
Talking about security risk, of course, we rescheduled because of what happened with a massive security risk, right? That touches a lot of the work that you're looking at. How has that influenced the way you're thinking about investing? How did that happen? I mean, is that a lack of attention in what matters, or is that just going to be the cost of business these days with the lack of real infrastructure that is secure?
I think there's a couple of interesting underpinnings to that. One, it just shows how connected the world is. Now, like that's such a lame thing to say because like we obviously know it.
But until it hits you, right, with all the flights.
Airline systems and banking. I had friends that were, visiting Denver this weekend who had a lot of flight issues, but they were talking about getting like handwritten plane tickets and stuff. It's kind of interesting, but there's also this giant question of platform versus best of breed. It's an analogy is like, it's kind of the accordion of the approved vendor list in large enterprises. Is it getting bigger or smaller? Meaning is there a platform effect or we're buying more vendors? It feels like in security and in enterprise software and in dev tooling and in infrastructure, right now, because of all like the cost optimizations of large companies, they kind of are going back into this like platform. Instead of buying a bunch of best in breed tooling, I will buy something that's 80% as good because it's from a single platform. Now, we talk about that in the venture community because we think about like buying cycles and budgets and stuff. But when you just think about global interconnectivity and cybersecurity, the truth is the vast bulk of the world's IT infrastructure probably runs on like 15 companies. Like it's just super, super concentrated. And it's not even necessarily the latest and greatest aging thing. The global DNS servers, which is like DNS, it's like domain names, went down, I want to say about a year ago. And it took down so many websites. And the truth is the DNS directory is run by like 10 people. It's just kind of like it goes down, you don't realize this stuff. And I think it's like we have a skyscraper where the basement is made out of something my 8-year-old boy's made out of toothpicks and like paste. It's very delicate. And I think because people ship code so quick, things change and it takes time, and maintaining that infrastructure is very complicated.
Which is really scary when, the foundation layer is what's holding a lot of our data that matters to the day-to-day person, right? From the bank account and all of that. So very worrying times. And in fact, I just had Sidra on from Munich Reventures, where she's doubling down on cybersecurity. It's a huge market. What else are you doubling down on? What specific trends that you're looking to in this environment?
Yeah. So, I mean, just stepping back generally in Intel Capital, like we invest in the future of compute, which is really ultimately 4 broad categories: cloud software, silicon, frontier, and devices. And so I'll take them in reverse order. Devices for us is really kind of client mobile technology for just a distributed world. Frontier is just what you'd expect. I mean, we've invested in everything from Figure AI, the humanoid robotic company, to Joby, like vertical takeoff and landing companies. So really a lot of applied computer vision, robotics. We have like deep expertise there. Silicon, I mean, at the end of the day, everything that empowers, our experience right now is running on CPUs, GPUs, networking, interconnects. We've been investing in around that for close to 3 decades. I think we have a really strong core competency in it. So we continue to invest heavily. Earlier, a little bit, we were talking about exits and paths. I mean, we had a massive IPO earlier in the year in Astera, which is a really great outcome. We had been in it since the Series B. So much of the world talks about, the AI bloom and GPUs, but in truth, it's a system. And so like when companies are building and training large models, the hyperscalers, there's GPUs, there's CPUs, but moving the data and the interconnects between them, the very large bottleneck. And that's what Astera solves and why they're a very large public company now. And then naturally cloud. And so that's cybersecurity, enterprise software, developer tools, infrastructure. And that's where myself and a couple partners spend a lot of our time. And beyond the areas I've focused on, and to be honest, this is one of the hardest things for me personally, and why I tend to get investments wrong a lot. It's like, I invest both in developer tools and infrastructure software, and quite often they can look the same, but if I don't look at them in the right aperture, I get it wildly wrong. And what I mean by that is like developer tools at the end of the day, to start, it almost like looks like a gimmick, and you're focusing a lot on like the individual. I'd be like, Sarah, you're an individual developer. At the end of the day, like, is this new tool, where does it fit in your workflow? How important is it to you? Would you literally quit your job and go somewhere else if they took it away? So it's almost like a consumer investment. So at the really early stage, like I'm not looking at revenue. There quite often isn't revenue at dev tools companies early. Yes, there's open source behind it, but then you can look at things like adoption and GitHub stars, but those aren't really leading indicators of success. And where I've gotten it wrong is I'll look at something that is a dev tool, but I'll look at it more like an infrastructure software investment. And what I mean by that is for core infrastructure software, it's much more of like an enterprise sale, because there is info security teams that need to look at the adoption of it. Quite often you need to run POCs with application development teams in the company that need to run some of it on this platform. There's the owners of the underlying primitives, compute and storage and like underneath it. And so I found like when I don't look at investments with the right aperture, wildly wrong. And it sounds easy, but in truth, like it's very murky at an early stage which path in infrastructure software they'll go. That is something where it's like always trying to refine the mental model, and you're looking at something now that's really early, but trying to think about over time, like how the business around it evolves. To me, it's like those are 2 clear lines in the road. But spending a lot of time on the problem statements I talked about, and spending a lot of time on helping some portfolio companies that are growing very well. They built something that has intense product market fit, as evidenced by just a lot of inbound growth, good growth in revenue, but where's the next concentric circle of value from a product perspective to start to build more value for your existing customers and laterally transfer within an existing customer to other lines of business or budget.
Before we go into, I guess, more of your investment strategy and how you're thinking about it, I'm curious, I guess, taking a step back, you are my first Intel Capital GP. Remind us again in terms of the structuring, because we've had different, I just mentioned Munich Reventures, right? The way they're structured is slightly different. Talk to us a little bit about how Intel Capital was structured. Is this a separate entity on its own? It sounds like a lot of the investments that you're making, I mean, for you to admit that you're making mistakes, this is not common for a VC to, come out right out of the bat saying I make a ton of mistakes all the time. And of course, with a corporate VC, sometimes that's viewed with some skepticism because although it's about taking risks, corporates are sometimes the dinosaur, right? Compared to the fast-moving startup. How is Intel Capital structured? Talk to us a little bit about how this works, balance sheet investing, risk, so on and so forth.
I'd first say, Sarah, it's interesting because, you hear CVC or VC. They're such broad categories. Like venture capital, it's everything from an angel investing to huge public market investors investing in late stage. It's such a big industry. And so I think no two organizations, whether corporate or regular financial VCs, are cut the same. We have the benefit of having existed for north of 30 years. The model has been refined over time, largely in the backs of data, because we just have so much data to look at where our best returns are, how we help companies the best, how we best engage and show up for founders, where we have the most access to the best founders around the biggest problem statements. And so Intel Capital, we invest off the balance sheet of Intel, but we kind of run fairly autonomously. So myself and 5 other partners, or our general partners, we operate internally a lot like you would think any of the Sandhill Road firms. They're not to be geographically specific, like any early stage venture capital firm. So we have our Monday partner meeting. We meet kind of all day. We meet with entrepreneurs really whenever we need to. Quite candidly, a lot of times ends up on Mondays and Tuesdays. So we invest between $300 and $500 million a year. We have about 250 portfolio companies right now. Of that $300 to $500 million a year, around $275 million tends to be our new investments. The rest are just follow-ons. Most of our deals are early stage. So our bread and butter is generally Series A. We'll invest in seed. We'll invest in Series B. And occasionally we'll invest later too. And that's usually when we have deep conviction, have met the founder multiple times, just didn't have an opportunity to invest. We tend to lead 70% of our new investments a year. We sit on boards. We have high ownership relative for the venture model to work at early stage. We invest in those domains I mentioned, cloud, silicon, frontier, and devices, because we know they drive the future of compute. We know they're going to matter in Intel in a long term. But for the short term, we have a lot of flexibility and autonomy. And I think Intel senior leadership and the board have always given us a lot of runway because we're kind of like the eyes and ears. We really can be long term. To your point, corporations, ultimately public companies, they have quarterly reports to the street. There's always that balance, but we focus in Intel Capital on really long term thinking, because for us to the Intel board, how is Intel successful? We've found and backed the next 5 Intels. That's how I think about it. We're trying to find the next things that will become generational, huge public companies, and doing it early. And so to do so, you need to operate at venture speed. We believe in domain experience. So our whole team are all specialists in the areas they focus. My partners that focus on cybersecurity, they know it very deeply well because we really believe in a prepared mind so that once we've seen something, we can move very fast. Had the privilege of having north of 250 IPOs in the past 30 years, another 500 exits. I think since 2018, we've had something like $12 billion plus of market cap companies in the public markets. So it's pretty amazing to be in stuff early and see it grow to such scale.
When you say that it's structured just like any Sandhill firm, are the GPs and the employees salaried employees, or are you GPs in the sense that you have economics and carry just like most of the venture funds out there?
So we're a hybrid between the two. So we're all very much blue badge carrying Intel employees, but our compensation program and how we kind of recruit investors, we're paid on carried interest. So our success is the success of our portfolio, the success back to Intel, and Intel shareholders are our investments. And so we're compensated very much to align interests with our founders. With Intel more broadly, to just take risk, and we ultimately need to perform very well to obviously earn carry and have large DPI back to Intel.
I tuned into a pretty awesome episode with your misfit founder, Avram Miller, right? Who talked about how he felt like a misfit and his job in Intel Capital was really to push Intel in a direction that they didn't necessarily want to go. And of course, that really shaped how Intel Capital was formed to be sustaining, but not all CVCs have succeeded. In fact, it is a challenging model to really continue to return in the way that's expected, right? What do you think Intel has done right here in terms of structuring a CVC?
Patience, to be honest. I think it's like understanding and having the patience to realize things take a long time to mature, and also understanding it's relationship business. And so when you look at the composition of our team, even it's folks that like have been venture investors, or, we actually have a lot of folks I have a very non-traditional background. It's like kind of ridiculous. I'm a venture capitalist, to be honest. I think it's a unique Venn diagram of patience, of intentionality around the strategy, and then lastly, having a structure that matches those two things. And what I mean by that is I actually will do a lot of calls with other folks in the CVC ecosystem who are setting up new corporate venture firms. And naturally, they'll reach out to us, and I'm happy to talk to them about that. And it's interesting because, to be honest, a lot of the calls will get tactical pretty quickly. Like, how do you do your investment committee? How do you do comp? And I'll kind of step back and be like, well, what's the goal? Because it's like, you shouldn't lead with process. You should lead with the goal and then reverse it in the process that makes sense. If the goal is to be a late stage pipeline into M&A, which we are not, we have a completely separate corporate development group. I think over those 700 exits, like under 30 or so have been to Intel. Like, we're not a pipeline into M&A. That's a completely fine model. If that was your strategy, that probably behooves late stage investing because it's companies of size and scale that are different. If your strategy is to be really, really nascent and take a lot of risk and see early things, well, then that's not only early stage, but if the process is then the public company board needs to approve investments, that will never work because of the time. We've had many iterations of board and management over the past 30 years that I think have all carried a trait of patience. And then as that patience just bought more time, we then had a lot of data to look at. And so we know we have the best returns, both strategically and financially, for Intel when we are early stage, when we have high ownership, which we're on the board because we're deeply involved in those companies. And because we're deeply involved, we have an economic and moral obligation to work very hard and partner closely with Intel and make those companies a success. And the data shows that. And so that's why we kind of stick to that bread and butter. I think one of the other problems that's behooved the venture industry is like, there's a little bit of lack of discipline. It's just like when I look at fund sizes increasing and just like multi-strategies, I mean, some people can make that work really well, but in truth, it's like there's a lot of interesting perverse motivations for doing a lot of that stuff, but just staying disciplined in what you can execute very, very well. It takes confidence, but it also takes, there are firms out there like that don't have big funds that are some of the best on the planet. They can raise the biggest funds on the planet if they wanted to, just because they're so successful. They've turned that down because they know their model works well for them. And I have like a very high respect for that, just because I think discipline it's hard when you get pulled in a lot of different directions.
Absolutely. And I do want to come back to the fact that you think you come from a non-traditional background, and you do, right? You started from counsel, really. How has that transition helped you?
I fell completely backwards in venture. Like, just rewinding a little bit, I was poli-sci undergrad. I went to college up in New England. And coming out of that, I actually was intending to go work on Wall Street in finance. And so I graduated undergrad in the spring of 2002. The fall semester of my senior year, 9/11 happened. At that time, the path to entry-level Wall Street jobs kind of just dried up because most of those firms pulled back on hiring. Also at the time, the dot-com bust was in full swing. I can't really tell you why I had taken the LSATs. I don't really remember, but I went to law school. I was the only lawyer in my family. I got to law school and I realized I'd be a terrible litigator. I'm just not wired that way. So I ended up going down the corporate law path. I lived and worked in New York City for a couple of years. I was doing kind of large public company M&A and IPOs. Then I came out to the Bay Area in 2008, and that's where I started getting exposed to technology. So I did a bunch of work for some large technology-focused private equity firms, semiconductor companies, large hyperscaler companies doing M&A and venture capital. And I just kind of knew being a law firm partner wasn't for me. And if I had to boil it down to it, Sarah, it's because it was a very transactional job. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I would feel like a mercenary. I'd go in and work on something very intensely for 12 months, but then we'd be done and off to the next thing. And I kind of wanted to see how it worked out. So I spent some time. I ended up joining Intel Capital. I went from being a revenue generator to a cost center. So like that was a very interesting transition, being, a law firm where it's billable hours to like you're a cost center company. Over time, I was our managing counsel. Then I became our chief operating officer. I was then sitting on our investment committee. I was involved in looking at a lot of that data I mentioned about like how we should invest in our operations. I had a little bit of outside in perspective because I had been kind of newer to Intel Capital at the time, and I worked with other venture funds. And then I think the path to investor just kind of naturally happened. I had a different network than folks. I was living in the Bay Area. I was a little bit younger than our other GPs, and I had friends who were engineering managers at a bunch of up and coming hyperscaler companies. So I kind of talked to them. It was also right around the time there was like a couple paths macro changes I was just kind of observing. And it wasn't just me. We were observing with it as a partnership and through my network of the individual developer was becoming the path of technology adoption in large companies. And then similar like cloud native infrastructures out of like the Googles of the world were very in their infancy, but it was just kind of enabled us. That's where large enterprises would run their IT estates. And so I kind of just looked at like the Venn diagram once again of, you can tell I'm structured in thinking of like where my network was, these macro trends and where I thought were opportunities. And I kind of made that transition. All my partners are supportive. We now have a wonderful COO. I haven't been a registered attorney in quite some time. But to answer your question, I think when I first started, I had a lot of imposter syndrome. I mean, we all do. Like if anyone that doesn't say it, they're just not self-aware, because venture is like really long feedback loops about whether you're good at it. You go and deploy a bunch of capital, then you go into like the trough of disillusionment because losses come fast. Like companies that don't have product market fit, like they don't have product market fit. And then success, like it is not linear. You'll have things that are doing amazing and they go off a cliff, and you'll have things that you think everyone just thought were going to die and kind of take off. But I had more of imposter syndrome because I didn't have a technical background, and I was focusing on like highly technical spaces. I overcompensated by like diving too deep into things. I just spent hours reading like developer docs, and I still do that, but like really, really deep. And it took me a while to realize there's a point of diminishing returns. It's much more about understanding the motivations of the buyer and the problem statement being solved. And so I spent a lot of time changing my network to focus on like end customers at different size companies and really like spending a lot of time with them to understand their needs.
I know we're proud of all our babies, but what is one that really maybe caught you off guard and then you just grew like deep conviction in it? And then the opposite is the anti-portfolio. So what did you miss? How did you miss it?
I'll talk about, so I have a portfolio company, FreshPaint. They announced a large Series B. So it's like timely and perfect. And it's a great example. So I led the Series A in FreshPaint in the summer of 2022. I want to make sure I get this right. So at the time, we had just a general thesis that customer data platform, we had a couple of theses operating generally. That first-party data was the most important data to give a business. First-party customer data, meaning like third-party cookies are going to go away at some point. They keep getting pushed out, but like your own customer data is the most important. Capturing that data, particularly through like web software product analytics, is really, really challenging. It involves like heavy engineering resources, precision tech and code. But the users of that data, product, marketing, sales, growth, like there was just this misalignment, like why they have to rely on engineering to get all that. So I got connected through a good friend of mine who was a seed investor in FreshPaint and met Fitz and Malice and the team. And they immediately checked the boxes on all those things. There was great capital efficiency in the business. Like they had gotten a certain level of ARR, burning like less money since inception. They were like very frugal, and they had gone through a hard seed raise, which they had raised in like March and April of 2020. So like they're very, very gritty. But what's interesting at the time is like a lot of their customers were healthcare companies. And when we poked upon it, why is because they could do this in a HIPAA compliant way. And I want to share this. It's really important because if you go look at FreshPaint now, they are a healthcare privacy platform. They have not pivoted. They haven't built anything new. They just like repositioned because that's where the market demands come. But when we brought this to their partners, I pitched the healthcare exposure as a risk to this business because I looked at it and said, that healthcare is too hard to sell to. It's like very complicated. Yes, they can do this, but maybe other people will catch up. Like they need to diversify. I was so wrong on that. We closed the deal. About 4 or 5 months later, Health and Human Services, one of the many agencies in the U.S., just put out a bulletin that didn't even change the rules. It just like clarified some guidance about like what does or doesn't impact HIPAA. Meanwhile, the FTC has been doing a lot of like fines against healthcare companies and like just broader consumer sentiment of like, we have privacy expectations. Nothing's more private than their health information. These things happen, and the founders came to us and were like, we need to lean into this hard. I credit to them, and they'd done their work. And I was like, of course, trust your judgment. They were so right. That business has grown 1,000% in the past 12 months. It's just scale. It's one of the fastest scaling enterprise software companies relative to capital efficiency we've seen. And I just wanted to share that because it's like such an amazing company, but the growth drivers for that business I viewed as a deal risk. And so it just kind of shows of like how much like luck is involved, but also like market timing and having backing founders who really know their spaces and have the ability to recognize that signals and lean into it.
So how do you come back from that? Admitting that you're wrong, I think that's a great thing, right, for any investor. But at the same time, an investor is seen to be, for a lot of founders as well, like a guiding hand in many ways. Do you not agree?
I think when I've talked to Stephen Fitzsimmons, he'll say there's a lot of stuff there tactically I've helped with recruiting and thinking through organizational design and thinking through how we set up like alignment between functional areas and raised in Series B, like who we should raise from and why. I think Fitz a lot of times said in that moment after investing to when that transition happened, it had been great growth. It was like the classic, I invested, it was growing great. We closed the round and then like the quarter after was flat. Like this happens a lot. It's kind of interesting. And I think if you went and asked him, he'd say like, I gave him space. We just invested. It's early. We have several years of runway. I'm not going to freak out over like 1 quarter of flat growth. Even 2, I like it. But it was just more of like, I remember that first board meeting where it went flat and they had a bunch of churn. It was just more a conversation with like marketing, sales, engineering, product, making sure there was an alignment on how they thought through, like making sure there wasn't silos of data and how they thought through the framework of like customer value, but then like giving them space to go figure it out. There's someone I deeply respect there, Charles Hudson, who's so I had the pleasure of working with Charles on the NVCA board. He was just the outgoing chair. He came into one of my like Kaufman fellow sessions a long time ago. He's got this 2x2 and it's like, he calls it when to intervene, but the way I've thought it through, it's just like the x-axis is your certainty, your subject matter expertise, and the y-axis is the consequence of this decision. So obviously like lower left, like low consequence, you don't know anything. That's like, I call it like the who cares zone. Upper right, like super consequential, and you're the expert in it. Like that is the intervening thing. In truth, I think with working in startups or like honestly just in life in general, you're never really in those buckets. You're in the other two. And they're the hardest ones to, I just like think about this all the time when I work with the founders. So like where things were like, where it's high a consequence, but like you're not the expert, that's like, I call that the destruction zone. Because I think advice without context is so dangerous. And so like, that's when you should be like, Sarah, I do not know that. Like, I've never done pricing packages. We should go find someone who does. Like, to be able to admit you don't know something, but so many people aren't wired to do that. And I just see people just throw in opinions, even if there's not like ill content, but they'll just say something. It's kind of like inception. Once that idea is planted, it grows into this other thing. And then the upper left, where I think where you have like deep expertise, but it's like low consequence, that's like the learning zone. I think that's where you'll see something about how they structure like a sales team or something about options where it's not like a legal risk, but it's like, you just know like, gosh, like this is going to backfire, but you also know it's like, it's not going to kill anything. It's so hard. You just so want to intervene and help. And I think that's when you don't. And so I think like knowing when to intervene, it's like one of the hardest things about this job that I'm like constantly trying to improve on, that I wish everyone in the venture ecosystem would like think through and focus on, because I think it would make board meetings way more productive. I think more companies would be successful. And I think as a venture capitalist or like serving on a board, it's like the most important, other than obviously being prepared and punctual and present. That's just basic stuff.
So it's funny that you bring this up in this way. And Love tells, he's going to be on the show next as well. You sit on the investment committee of Intel Capital, of a large corporate managing billions of dollars. What do founders need to know about the dynamics inside the investment committee?
So Intel Capital, we intentionally have an investment committee where everyone has different subject matter expertise. So my partner, Anthony, he has deep silicon experience. Mark does a lot of cloud stuff. So we try to bring different perspectives, and I think importantly are also set up where we don't need unanimous votes. And so we'll have everyone meet it, but we're willing to move forward with things when there's dissent, and we do it. Now, we certainly need a majority of us to go forward with something, but we really try to ensure that we're not getting into groupthink, which is really important. Now, another thing we do is we actually do a lot of work amongst the GPs before he gets to that. We operate into capital, we have the cloud domain and frontier and silicon devices, where we talk about opportunities very early. We're quite often a GP or two has met the founders if we're not personally investing the deal and spend a lot of time with them. So by the time it comes up to investment committee, really the conversation is more about okay, the subject matter expertise are signed off on this. But we think it's important for someone who has no idea about this space to look at it and poke holes on it, because we always have biases. You have blind spots, you have biases, and it's quite often someone who doesn't come from that world can spot stuff. You're just we'll be in the forest looking at a little anthill when they're hey, the whole corner of the forest is on fire over here. Go pay attention. Naturally, there's internal controls and procedures, and you need to run things up the chain. But for our bread and butter, classic Series A investments, our follow-ons, it's the Intel Capital. We run this a partnership. We're compensated like a partnership. We try to have a prepared mind. We seek risk. We have a power law portfolio, just like any other commensurate with an early stage venture firm. And I think we really try to tell the team an embrace of it's okay to make mistakes. What's a cardinal sin is just not learning from them. If you make the same mistake 5 times in a row, it's okay, now we have a problem. We need to talk about this. Where did our systems and processes go wrong where we keep doing the same thing?
Do you believe in a 50-50 reserve strategy, or how do you think about follow-on capital? What's the decision-making framework there?
Yeah, so we actually, because we're a balance sheet, we don't have, it's not the 2024 vintage where we'll invest X dollars and we'll reserve the same. It's that vintage, we'll have new investments come out of it, the 300 to 500 million, but we will do follow-ons as well. So there's a pros and cons to this. On the one hand, we are a deep pocket and we have the ability to be patient and continue to invest in our companies and follow-ons. On the other hand, we can't just sit there and point to reserves and a fund size, pull our pockets out when things are tough and be sorry, I don't have any reserve capital for you. So now I say that because there could be times where maybe we shouldn't have followed on. Maybe emotionality got too much into it, and how do we have that forcing function? So I would say and truthfully, we look at every investment with the same set of lenses, the same aperture of it's and not a new investment because we have more information at this point. But we're looking at the risk adjusted return profile of that investment. What did we say was going to be done? What was done? What's changed? What direction are they going in now? Now where they're at based off of the price and ownership, do we think this makes for a large venture outcome?
Yeah, it's a big signal if you don't, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, tough call. And I want to be respectful of your time here. Very quickly, market conditions have not been great. We've got a lot of uncertainty, to say the least, with what happened over the last few weekends, from CrowdStrike to the elections coming up. What are your thoughts on the market? Are we going to see something positive? Is it a wait and see? Are we going to dry up?
Macroeconomics, where the political landscape goes, it is so impossible to forecast. So I kind of go back to where we started with of talking to my founders, you cannot control any of this. I cannot control this as an individual investor. I'm going to focus on what I really kind of think I can control, which is my process, how I meet founders, the areas I'm focusing on. If there is one macro thing I would say generally, and I do, to not be disingenuous, I certainly kind of talk about this. Enterprise sales cycles are very hard right now. There is just more eyeballs inside large companies. Budgets are tighter. New tools, new software procurement processes are harder. So when I do look at investments and I do counsel our boards and our portfolio companies, it's a lot of the assumptions that were from the past 5 years, you just throw those at the door. Everything is going to take longer. Growth rates are going to be smaller. Share of wallets just going to go down. And so we take that into account in our underwriting.
Well, tempered optimism, it seems, from Nick Washburn here from Intel Capital. All right, we're transitioning to quick fire round, $1 billion question. First job you got paid for?
I worked at the Tampa Greyhound track doing maintenance, and doing an example that is cleaning gutters, going out to a massive parking lot and repainting the yellow lines in the yellow parking curbs when think Florida in the summer in July.
Oh my goodness, sounds fabulous. And the scorching heat.
It was marvelous.
What's a book that you've gifted to others the most or recommend? And one key tenet from that book that you love?
I'll give a fiction and nonfiction, if that's okay. Fiction, Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole. It's an amazing backstory. He was like 17 or 18. He wrote this book, sadly committed suicide. His mom found the manuscript amongst his belongings, and they were in New Orleans and sent it to a bunch of publishers who wouldn't publish it, sent it to a professor at Tulane, I believe, who read it, thought it was amazing, got in the hands of publisher, and got publisher won the Pulitzer Prize. It's just an incredibly funny book. The protagonist is just ridiculous. It's just hard to even describe. And as far as like nonfiction book, I like historical pieces. It's good learning. It's a very sad book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is just the story of, just Native American history in the United States and kind of what happened to indigenous people in the U.S. with, colonialism and the settling of America and the expansion of the American West. It's a travesty. It's really a horrible time in America's history, but I think it's an important thing for people to understand.
Yeah. Just to bring us home here, you mentioned your twin boys that you're proud of, and I can actually hear them running back and forth in the house behind you there.
Yeah.
What are 3 principles, if nothing else, that you want, years later, if by chance Spotify is still a thing and they're tuning into this from their dad, what's the 3 key principles you want your boys to remember or live by?
That's a great question. I'd like them to have a learning mindset on anything they want to do. Approach things with humility, like seeking to learn. Listen before you speak, and maintain a strong moral compass, as evidenced by how you show up and treat other people.
Love that. And with that, well, right on the hour, Nick, thank you so much for your time and for making the billion-dollar moves that you have over the years and decades of your career. And I'm excited to see more billion-dollar moves from you and Intel Capital.
Thanks, sir. I really appreciate this. This is a lot of fun.
And thanks so much for tuning in this week. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow our socials on Sarah Chen Global to get the latest on the show. It would really help me out too if you enjoyed this to rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts and share your favorite episodes with a friend. I'm Sarah Chen-Spellings, and you've been listening to Billion Dollar Moves.